Hello all. I actually think a lot of you probably know me. I am the Cultural Resources Coordinator for Summit Metro Parks, which is a metropolitan park district, a county level park district in Summit County, Ohio, which is Northeast Ohio, for anyone who's not familiar. And this presentation is really going to be, I'm hoping, something that will be helpful if you're thinking about how to do archaeological field work with volunteers or with students or field schools or anything like that as we're going forward and, you know, in the continuing throes of the COVID-19 pandemic. So hopefully this will give some of you some ideas of ways that you can continue to move forward. And I think it's probably going to be a kind of a specter that is looming in the background for probably longer than we would like. So just to give you a little outline, also to show you where we're talking about in Summit County, Northeastern Ohio. I'm going to talk about the site that we excavated, and not a lot of details on it because that's really not the point of this talk, but just because some of the characteristics of the site made it ideal for adapting these procedures. So the site itself, the procedures and guidelines that we used in order to adapt what we were doing with the pandemic and keep everyone safe, the outcomes, and then some of the lessons that we've learned and some of the things that we will navigate going forward. So just to give you an idea of the site that we were looking at, this is the Mingo Shelter area. This is in our kind of our flagship park, which is Sand Run Metro Park. It's located, so this is just showing you the Google Maps view of it. And it's located very near the Cuyahoga River. You can see that off a bit to the east here. And it's also located very near the portage path. So the portage between the Cuyahoga and Tuscarawas river sheds, this is actually over here at this intersection, is the close to the northern terminus of the portage path. We also have kind of off a little bit further to the east and to the south, there's another large habitation site called Big Bend that dates to the middle to late Woodland period. And there's some smaller habitation sites, some isolated finds kind of throughout this area. The shelter itself, here we go, was built by the 3C in the 1930s. This park was one of our first parks. It opened in 1928. I think that's when the first nature hike there was. And a lot of the infrastructure for the park was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression. And I bring this up because even though this is a play field that has been, you can see in the picture, it's been graded at least using hand tools. Nothing has been there since. It hasn't really been subject to a lot of disturbance or anything like that. It has been investigated. Linda Whitman did an investigation of the site in 2008. At that time, Summit Metro Parks did not want her to dig through the playfield, which is still very active. It's still active today. So she and her crew kind of made this U-shaped investigation, did this U-shaped survey around the playfield, you know, kind of according to what Summit Metro Parks wanted at that time. The site was discovered. There were a number of positive test units. This is a phase 1 survey. They found a number of pre-contact sites. They also found during that survey a Snyder's Point. You can see there's a railway that's going off, kind of off here to the east. And there's a slope between the site and the rail line. And the Snyder's Point was found somewhere along this slope. So we know that it's a site, and we wanted to investigate it more. In 2019, my colleague and I did a little like kind of a show and tell thing for students from a local high school, Ellet High School. And we were like, we wanted to see what's out at Mingo. We'll go and do some test units there and show them what test units look like. So we dug a couple of test units actually in the playfield area. We got permission to do that and found a projectile point. We found a Madison point, a scraper, 14 flakes. We found FCR. So we thought, let's put this on the books sooner rather than later. So these are the points that were found for this area. It turns out that since the original excavation had been done in 2008, Summit Metro Parks has allowed this back area of the playfield to go to seed, essentially. So it's becoming forested. So there was less resistance to us doing an archaeological dig across this playfield now than there had been in the past. We were able to work with our operations crew, and they agreed to, they're very juvenile trees, they're very young trees, and they agreed to brush hog some transects for us through this area. So we were allowed to do that this year. This site was really ideal for this investigation also because it's isolated. It was a site that it has its own, because it's its own shelter, it has its own parking area, it has its own restrooms, and it happens to be a site that is a little bit isolated from things that are surrounding it. So you have to actively be going to that shelter, to that parking area. And it is a little bit off the beaten track from the most popular trail in this park, which is kind of down a hill from it. So we had planned on doing a field school investigation there, regardless of COVID. We were going to do this. We were going to do it in June of this year. We had planned this since last year. We're doing this with the University of Akron, offering their students a field school opportunity. And in fact, COVID hit, and we thought the same thing that everyone thought, which is we're not going to be able to do field work this year. We can't do field work with students. We can't do field work with volunteers. How are we going to adapt this so that people are safe, so that they are not coming in close contact with one another? So these were all of the concerns that we knew that we would have to deal with. Initially, I personally really thought we weren't going to be able to do anything this year. I thought we're just canceling and that's it. I talked with Tim Matney. If any of you know him, he's in the anthropology department at the University of Akron, and he was very adamant that we do something for the students, that we have some kind of field experience for them, because part of it was he'd gotten permission to do it from the department, and he didn't want to give that up. He was afraid that if we gave that up, that we wouldn't get it back. So we took on the challenge of developing some guidelines. So the first thing that we did was sat down and thought about what are all of the things that you need to think about in a pandemic? What are the things that you need to keep people safe from? So the first thing was we had to think about transmission and think about it in terms of person-to-person transmission, surface transmission, and airborne transmission. Because really almost regardless of what's coming out of the news about like how it's being transmitted, at the time we were planning this, there was a lot of confusion about how it was being transmitted. And there's still some questions about exactly how it's being transmitted. So we had to take all of these into consideration. We had to think about social distancing, certainly sanitizing any kind of surfaces, because archaeological sites share equipment. You're using all kinds of things. You're, borrowing tape measures, stuff like that. And then also think about monitoring symptoms. If students show up with symptoms, if people have symptoms, making sure that we're becoming aware of it, either if they have symptoms prior to coming, that they're not coming, and making people responsible for that, for monitoring themselves. And if they do have symptoms, that they're reporting them. And we also had to think really hard, and this was probably one of the biggest issues, was thinking about group size, because it had to be limited at the time, and really still, we had to keep it to under 10 people on the site. And of course, the most important part of it, you're thinking about all of these logistical things, but the outcome should be that the students are getting an experience that is meaningful and that gives them some sense of doing archaeology in the field, not just during a pandemic, but going forward, that they have this experience that they'll be able to parlay into a career in archaeology if that's what they want to do, or into grad school or what have you. So it had to be something that wasn't just an exercise in can we do it? It had to be something that was meaningful for the students. So we set to work developing our guidelines, and the first part of this was a lot of coordination between the park system and between the University of Akron. So the departments that were involved in the park system were the department I work out of, which is the conservation department, the operations department, because they're the people that maintain the site, they're the people that maintain the lodge and the restrooms, mow the lawns, things like that. Between human resources, because they're the people that are putting out our guidelines for how we deal with COVID, the rangers, so that they know. We always like to let the rangers know what's going on, and marketing, in case people call in and say, why do you have people that are up there at that site? At the University of Akron, of course, coordinating between the department and the College of Arts and Sciences. So we had two main points of contact, and I think that was really important. So that was myself for the parks and Tim Matney for the University of Akron. And what we developed, so in order to monitor students and keep the site safe, we developed all these guidelines, and I'll go through them a little bit more. Screening questions and sign-ins, limiting access to the site, limiting the number of personnel who are on the site. We did a rotating schedule for students, making sure everyone is wearing face coverings, designing the project so that you can social distance, and the management of equipment. So I'll go through all of these first. The face covering, social distancing, and the managing of equipment was really put on the students. And if they were unable to maintain these aspects of their behavior, really, then that would disqualify them from coming onto the site. And I see this really as no different than any other kind of behavioral aspects to working on a site. These are the things that we ask them to do that were important for working on this site. Every site is different, and they might be asked to do different things for different sites. So this was just what they were asked for this site. So they had to wear face coverings if they were in close contact with one another. Basically everywhere on the site, unless they were actively digging a hole, they had to wear face coverings. Social distancing, maintaining at least 6 feet between one another. And then we actually, the University of Akron got money to buy each student, and this was great, to give them each their own field equipment kit. And they were in charge of that for themselves. They had to make sure that they weren't sharing that and keep track of it, which in my opinion was a really great thing, because, really actively forcing students to inventory and keep track of their equipment is, that's nothing but helpful. You'll be doing that for your whole career anyway. So the screening questions we developed based on the guidelines from the CDC, as well as what the University of Akron was doing and Summit Metro Parks. One of the things that we kind of had to navigate was how much medical information you're allowed to ask for from students, and keep, because of course that's private information. So in the end, we just asked people about their contact, what they knew of their contact with people that had symptoms, whether they had traveled or not, and whether they themselves had symptoms. And they just answered. We didn't ask anybody what are your symptoms? Do you have a fever? What is your fever? We asked them to say, yes, they had them, or no, they didn't have them. So to affirm that they didn't have symptoms before they were allowed to go on the site. The site access, everyone had to come in separate transportation to park in the designated area for the lodge. The limit of 6 students per day was made possible through using like a kind of I think it's Springboard that the students use, where they were scheduling themselves for shifts. So they were also kind of put in charge of scheduling themselves to make sure they were getting X number of hours over the entirety of the field school. So I think that was a great exercise in their personal responsibility as well. And we did it in half-day shifts. So people could come in for, I think it was 3 or 4 hour shifts, and then they would switch off. The scheduling, I think, worked really well for making sure that we kept the limit to 10 people per day, and making sure that everyone was able to get the number of hours that they needed. We already kind of talked a little bit about these things. And I think this is just a common sense at this point for dealing with the pandemic, the idea of wearing face coverings and social distancing and the equipment management. And something that I also drove home to the students is that this is still a public park. It's still an area where the public can access. We can't stop people from coming out and saying, hey, what are you doing on the site? And having these procedures in place, make sure that you're safe and make sure that the public is safe as well. So that's the public access logistical consideration. We were lucky in that this site has its own restrooms. We had an outside spigot that we could use for artifact processing, which made that easier. So we didn't have to take those into the lab. And Eric can tell you, he was out there doing some guest instruction on what are lithics. And I think that worked out really well. There's a set of picnic tables out there because, again, it is a lodge, it is a park. So we did have access to picnic tables to set things up. One of the methodological considerations that we really had to navigate as we were doing the research was when you find something in a shovel test, we wanted them to have the experience of opening up larger excavation units. So kind of navigating that and letting, it turned into making sure that everyone has their own turn working in the excavation units. And we did have a couple of times where people were working together in them, and that was a case where they had to wear the face coverings while they were in the excavation units together. The artifact processing was something that, because we had the spigot, some of it could be done outdoors. So that gave people kind of an on-site introduction to artifact processing, which I think was really helpful. So over the course of this field school, we did have 50 shovel test units as well as 2 larger excavation units that were opened, and they were able to become familiarized with a variety of artifacts, of pre-contact artifacts. We didn't find any features, unfortunately, but they did have the meaningful experience doing archaeology that we wanted them to have. They had a pretty normal field school experience. It was almost like all of this, the work to make sure that they were safe was done, a lot of it at the front end. And then once they got used to what was expected of them on the site, it just kind of started to really be natural for them. So this was what we had with the student. We had 11 students who were signed up for the field school. And throughout the course of the field school, they were able to dig 55 shovel test units. And the big win was that nobody got COVID-19. Nobody came down with it, became infected with it. And everyone was able to get the hours that they needed. And the big thing is that we'll be able to, and we are adapting this going forward. So this is just giving you an idea of what the site itself looked like. So it just really looked like a normal archaeological site with everyone wearing masks, and everyone, the students each got their own kind of field bag and a bucket that had their equipment with it. So they would just move it. It was more equipment than we probably normally would have on a site, but it was worth it. For things like the total station that had to be shared, those were disinfected between each use. We had a huge array of sanitizing wipes and hand sanitizer and masks on the site at all times. The University of Akron was responsible for that. So there was never a shortage of those things, and being able to make sure that things were sanitized between uses. If you want to know more, this is actually my colleague Charlotte Gintert, who was on the site and did all the photography that you've seen here. She also wrote an article for the SHA newsletter on archaeology on this site, on what we did. So that's the SHA volume 53, number 3. And the last thing that I have for you is kind of an addendum. Because it was successful, we went ahead and we adapted it to a geophysical class that's happening out there right now. Of course, the inevitable happened, and we had 3 people that came down with symptoms on October 12th. And it was sort of like, oh crap, what do we do? Well, we do just what we had set out to do. We followed our own guidelines. So we had 3 people who came down with symptoms. We shut down the site immediately. Those 3 people got tested. One of them tested positive for COVID-19. It transpires now, we've learned that the student's roommate tested positive for COVID-19 prior to this student testing positive. So it's likely that the student got it from their roommate, and the real kind of win for us, it's not a win that, the student got COVID-19, but the win for us is that no one else on the site got it. So the safety protocols that we put in place did work. As far as we know, we're in day 11 of, it's a 14-day shutdown for the site. But as far as we know, no one else has gotten it. So we recommended to the students that they all quarantine. We haven't had anyone else report symptoms. And I think the big takeaway on this is that the protocols do work, and that you can't control, like the student is living with a roommate, first of all, which the University of Akron is allowing. We can't control what people do off of the site. I can't ask people to do really anything except when they're on the site. We can require them to follow these safety procedures. And now we got a sense that these safety procedures are working, and that we are able to do meaningful archaeological work with students based on these procedures. And I would be happy to share them with anybody if you're interested. We have a document that has them written up. We have the sign-in questionnaire that all the students are supposed to answer each day before they come to the site. They come on the site, they sign in. They sign their name when they come into the site, and that's their acknowledgement that they have gone through the questionnaire and they're allowed on the site. So I have those documents if anybody is interested in them. But it's really just upfront organization and then consistency on the site. And making it, I think a big part of it is making everybody responsible for site safety. And that to me is no different than any archaeological site. Everyone who's on the site, who's working on the site, is responsible for site safety. And this is just a different aspect of site safety. So that is my presentation. I think I came pretty close to 20 minutes, so. Keep doing archaeological work.
I'll clap on behalf of everyone participating, so then we don't have a lot of clapping on the
Yeah.
Thank you, Megan. Someone just posted a question on our Twitch chat asking, are you all doing screening fever checks? But I don't think that came up.
We didn't do, we started out thinking we were going to do that, and then 2 things happened. One is that it became unclear how accurate fever screenings were going to be. And the other thing was that we didn't want to be seen to be collecting specific medical information about the students. So we ended up not doing fever screenings.